What if one of the most significant threats to your health had nothing to do with what you eat, how you sleep, or what your lab results show? What if it was something far more quietly pervasive, something that affects roughly half of all American adults, something that most people never mention to their doctor, and that most doctors never think to ask about? In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General made a declaration that surprised many people. He declared loneliness a public health epidemic, and he stated that the health risks of chronic loneliness are comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Not a full pack, but 15 cigarettes every single day. That is not a metaphor. That is a statement grounded in a major research analysis of over 300,000 people, one that found lonely individuals are 50% more likely to die prematurely than those with strong social connections. And yet, loneliness remains one of the most underaddressed risk factors in chronic illness. Today, we're going to change that. Welcome back. I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist. We've just completed a 5-part series on relationships and the nervous system, exploring how early relational experiences shape our nervous system's default patterns, how difficult relationships and unresolved conflict keep the body in chronic stress, and how grief and loss live in the nervous system long after the events themselves have passed. Today we're beginning a new series that grows directly out of that one, because underneath many of the relational patterns we explored, the people-pleasing, the over-responsibility, the difficulty with conflict, the unprocessed grief, there is often something else. Something quieter, something many people carry without ever naming it. Loneliness. Not always the obvious kind, not necessarily the loneliness of someone who has no one, but often a subtler, more pervasive kind, the loneliness of feeling unknown, even in the presence of others. The loneliness of having an experience, especially the experience of chronic illness, that people around you cannot fully see or understand. The loneliness of having learned somewhere along the way that it isn't entirely safe to be fully yourself in relationship. Over the next several episodes, we are going to explore loneliness from the perspective of the nervous system. We will look at the patterns and beliefs that keep people lonely even when connection is available. We will look at the specific ways chronic illness deepens isolation. And we will talk about neural retraining and what it has to offer, not just for loneliness as an emotional experience, but for the nervous system's fundamental capacity to feel safe in connection. But today, let's start with the foundation, what loneliness actually is, why it matters so profoundly to our health, and why it is so much more complex than it might seem on the surface. Let's begin by redefining what loneliness is. Most of us were taught, implicitly or explicitly, that loneliness is weakness, something to be ashamed of, something that reflects a failure to connect, or a personality that is somehow lacking. But that understanding is not accurate. Loneliness is a biological signal. It is the nervous system's way of telling us that something essential for survival is missing. The U.S. Surgeon General put it this way: loneliness is like hunger or thirst. It is a feeling the body sends us when something we need is absent. Not a character flaw, not a personal failure, a signal. And just as hunger signals the need for food, and thirst signals the need for water, loneliness signals the need for something that human beings are wired to require at a fundamental neurological level: genuine connection. We are a deeply social species. Our nervous systems evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in the context of community. Connection wasn't simply a comfort or a preference. It was a survival requirement. To be part of a group meant safety, resources, protection. To be isolated from a group meant vulnerability and danger. And the nervous system learned that lesson at a level far deeper than conscious thought. Which means that when we experience chronic loneliness, when the signal goes unmet for a long period of time, the nervous system doesn't simply feel sad. It activates. It goes into a subtle but persistent state of threat response. Because at a biological level, isolation still registers as danger. The research on loneliness and health is both extensive and sobering. The landmark meta-analysis that the Surgeon General referenced drew on data from 148 studies and over 300,000 participants, followed for an average of 7.5 years. It found that people with strong social relationships had a 50% greater likelihood of survival than those who were isolated or lonely. To put that in perspective, 50%. That is a larger effect than many well-established health risk factors. Chronic loneliness has been linked to significantly increased risk of heart disease and stroke. It is associated with immune suppression, making the body less effective at fighting illness. It raises the risk of developing dementia. It contributes to depression, anxiety, and disrupted sleep. It is associated with higher levels of systemic inflammation, the same chronic inflammation that underlies so many chronic conditions. And perhaps most relevant to listeners of this podcast, loneliness and social isolation are associated with worse outcomes across a wide range of chronic illnesses. They don't just cause suffering alongside chronic illness, they actively interfere with the body's ability to heal. One more statistic worth noting: about half of American adults report experiencing measurable loneliness, and that number has been rising for decades, well before the pandemic accelerated it further. This is not a fringe problem. This is one of the defining health challenges of our time. Before we go further, I want to make an important distinction, because there are really two quite different kinds of loneliness, and understanding the difference matters enormously for what can actually help. The first kind is what we might call circumstantial loneliness. This is loneliness that comes from external circumstances: a move to a new city, the loss of a relationship or a community, a period of illness that limits social activity, the early months of new parenthood, retirement from a career that provided daily connection. Circumstantial loneliness is real, and it can be significant, but it is also in principle addressable through external changes. When circumstances shift, when the person finds community, when life opens back up, the loneliness often resolves. The second kind of loneliness is deeper and more complex. This is the loneliness that persists even when connection is available, even when the person has people in their life, even when they are, by external appearances, socially connected. This is the loneliness of feeling unknown, of being in a room full of people and feeling completely alone, of having relationships that feel somehow surface level, no matter how hard you try to deepen them, of never quite feeling like you fully belong. The second kind of loneliness is not primarily a circumstantial problem. It is a nervous system problem. It comes from patterns, often laid down early in life, that make genuine connection feel unsafe, unavailable, or somehow out of reach. And it is the second kind of loneliness that no amount of social activity alone can fully resolve, because the nervous system is not yet in a state where it can receive what connection offers. Let's talk about what happens in the nervous system during chronic loneliness. When the nervous system is in a persistent state of perceived isolation, it activates the same threat response we've discussed throughout this series. Stress hormones rise. the immune system shifts towards an inflammatory posture. The body's repair and recovery processes are deprioritized. Sleep becomes less restorative. The brain becomes more vigilant, scanning for threat, more reactive to perceived rejection or criticism. And here is something particularly important for people with chronic illness. This nervous system state, the state of perceived isolation and disconnection, overlaps significantly with the nervous system dysregulation that underlies many chronic conditions. They feed each other. Chronic illness creates isolation through physical limitation, through the difficulty of being understood, through the contraction of life that illness can bring. And that isolation deepens the nervous system dysregulation that is already making the illness harder to heal. It is a cycle, a self-reinforcing cycle, and it is one that rarely gets addressed in conventional treatment. I want to speak directly for a moment to those of you who are living with chronic illness. Loneliness is extraordinarily common in this community, and it takes many forms. There is the loneliness of physical limitation, of not being able to participate in the social activities that used to be part of your life. There is the loneliness of invisible symptoms, of having an experience that others cannot see and is therefore difficult for them to truly understand or validate. There is the loneliness of feeling like a burden, of withdrawing from relationships because you don't want your illness to be what defines you. There is the loneliness of the medical system, of feeling unseen, dismissed, or reduced to a set of test results that don't capture what you're actually experiencing. And there is a deeper, older loneliness that chronic illness often surfaces, one that was present long before the illness began. The loneliness of someone who learned early in life that it wasn't entirely safe to be fully known, who developed patterns of independence, self-sufficiency, or caretaking that kept others at a careful distance, who has always been more comfortable giving than receiving. Chronic illness has a way of bringing this older loneliness to the surface, because illness requires vulnerability and dependence and receiving, the very things that can feel most difficult for people whose nervous systems learned early that those things were not safe. And we'll explore all of this in much more depth in the episodes ahead. Over the next few episodes, we're going to explore loneliness from the inside out. We will talk about the specific patterns, beliefs, and nervous system responses that keep people lonely, even when connection is available. The fear of being truly known, the hyper-independence that developed as a protective strategy, the ways perfectionism and shame create invisible walls between ourselves and others. We'll look at the two-way relationship between chronic illness and loneliness, how each deepens the other, and what the cycle looks like in the nervous system. We'll talk about the specific loneliness of invisible illness, of having an experience that others cannot see or validate, and what that does to the nervous system over time. And we'll end the series where we always end, with what becomes possible when we work with the nervous system directly. Because loneliness is not simply solved by being around more people. When the nervous system has learned that closeness is unsafe, or that the self is somehow unworthy of genuine connection, more social contact alone often is not enough. The work needs to go deeper, to the subconscious patterns that are keeping the door to genuine connection closed. When those patterns shift, when the nervous system begins to feel genuinely safe in a relationship, something opens, not just emotionally, but physically. Because healing from loneliness and healing from chronic illness are not separate projects. They are, in so many ways, the same project. If loneliness is part of your experience, whether it's the visible, circumstantial kind or the quieter kind that persists even in the presence of others, I want you to hear something important. This is not a character flaw. It is not a weakness. It is not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It is a signal from a nervous system that is wired for connection, and it is telling you that something essential is missing. And the good news, the genuinely hopeful news, is that the nervous system can learn new patterns. Patterns of safety, of openness, of genuine belonging. That learning is possible, and when it happens, it changes not just how we feel in relationships, it changes how we feel in our bodies. We'll begin exploring exactly how in our next episode. If you would like to learn more about this work in the meantime, please visit us at tcneuralretraining.com. Schedule a free consultation by phone or take our free quiz to see if neural retraining might be right for you. And if this episode resonated with you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for listening. Content of this podcast, copyright 2026 by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.